Hello, my name's Gabe. For this problem, we're asked to sketch the graph of r equals 3 times 1 minus cosine of theta using symmetry, the zeros of r, the maximum r values, and then we're going to plot some additional points to get a better idea as to what the graph looks like. So let's start by discussing the symmetry of r equals 3 times 1 minus cosine of theta. So looking at our function r, we see that r is a function of cosine of theta. So we see that we can write r as g of cosine of theta. Now, what this tells us by our quick test for symmetry is that r is symmetric with respect to the polar axis. So we have polar axis symmetry. The next thing we would like to concern ourselves with is the zeros of r. So in order to find the zeros of r, we want to solve the equation 0 equals 3 times 1 minus cosine of theta. So what we can do here is we can start by dividing both sides of this equation by 3. And that leaves us with 0 is equal to 1 minus cosine of theta. Here we can add cosine of theta to both sides of the equation. So we have cosine of theta equals 1. So now, in order to solve for theta, well, we'll want to note that cosine of theta equals 1 at even multiples of pi. So when theta equals an even multiple of pi. But since we're trying to sketch the graph, and we know that our graph is symmetric with respect to the polar axis, we only need to concern ourselves with values of theta between 0 and pi. So the only time that cosine of theta is equal to 1 on the interval from 0 to pi is when theta equals 0. So next, we'll want to look for the maximum r values. So just looking at our function r, we have r equals 3 times 1 minus cosine of theta. So here, the first thing we want to think about is the range of cosine of theta. So remember that cosine of theta ranges between -1 and 1. So what we'll see here is that the largest value we're going to get for r is when cosine of theta equals -1. And in that case, we're going to have r equals 3 times 1 minus a -1. So r is equal to 3 times 2, which is 6. So the maximum r value is 6. Now let's go ahead and find out where this occurs. So like I said, the maximum is going to happen when cosine of theta equals -1. So let's solve the equation cosine of theta equals -1. Now, since we have polar axis symmetry, we're only concerned with values of theta between 0 and pi. So we want to find out where on that interval from 0 to pi is cosine of theta equal to -1. Now, thinking about it, or referring to the unit circle, we'll see that theta has to be pi for cosine of theta to be equal to -1 on this interval from 0 to pi. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to try to sketch our graph, but really we only know 2 points. So we want to go ahead and try to plot maybe a couple more points. So we know that when theta is equal to 0, we found that r is also equal to 0. And this came from our zeros. Next, let's plot a point between 0 and pi over 2. Let's say pi over 3. So here, if we substitute pi over 3 into r, we'll have r is equal to 3 times 1 minus cosine of pi over 3, which ends up being 3/2, or 1.5. Next, let's think about what happens when theta is equal to pi over 2. So if theta is pi over 2, we're going to have 3 times 1 minus cosine of pi over 2, which is 3 times 1 minus 0, which is 3. So the r value at pi over 2 is 3. Next, let's think about another value between pi over 2 and pi, maybe 2 pi divided by 3. So for this, if we substitute this back into r, we'll have 3 times 1 minus cosine of 2 pi over 3, which ends up being 9 halves, or 4.5. And continuing on, if we go ahead and substitute pi in for theta into r, well, we already know what r is equal to when theta is equal to pi. We know that it obtains the maximum value of 6. So now we have a couple points that we want to plot. So remember, these are theta values and r values. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start at theta equals 0, and our r value is also 0. So we're going to start at the origin. Next, we want to think about an angle, a theta value, of pi divided by 3, and our r value is going to be 1.5. So what we're going to do is we're going to form an angle of pi over 3 radians, and we're going to come up 1.5 units. Next, we'll look at an angle, or a theta value, of pi over 2, and we see that our r value is 3. So we'll be passing through the point pi over 2, 3. Next, we'll be at 2 pi divided by 3, and our r value is 4.5. So we'll form an angle of 2 pi divided by 3. And we'll want to imagine coming out 4.5 units. Next, we know that at theta equals pi, our r is equal to 6. So when we come over pi radians, we're going to be at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, we also know that our graph is going to be symmetric with respect to the polar axis. So what we can imagine doing is taking each of these points and reflecting them about the polar axis. So now that we have some points, let's go ahead and sketch our graph. So there we have the graph of r equals 3 times 1 minus cosine of theta. Thank you.